In the mid-15th century, a German inventor named Johannes Gutenberg developed one of the most transformative machines in human history, the movable type printing press. Before this invention, books were copied by hand. Knowledge moved slowly. Authority controlled access to information. The printing press changed that. Within decades, books, pamphlets, and translated Bibles spread across Europe. Literacy increased. Ideas traveled faster than rulers could control them. And that is precisely why it was restricted. By the 16th century, both church and state began regulating printing. In 1559, the Catholic Church established the Index of Forbidden Books under the authority of Pope Paul IV. Certain works were banned outright. Printing presses required licenses in many regions. The technology itself wasn't outlawed, but its output was censored. Control over knowledge became a political weapon. The printing press was not dangerous because it was flawed. It was dangerous because it empowered ordinary people. Gunpowder originated in China centuries earlier, but by the 14th century it had reached Europe and the Islamic world. Cannons began appearing in warfare. These early artillery systems changed everything. Stone castles that had stood for centuries were suddenly vulnerable. Armored knights lost their battlefield dominance. Centralized states gained power. Authorities quickly realized how destabilizing this technology was. In parts of medieval Europe, possession of certain firearms without royal permission was punishable. Gunpowder production was tightly controlled. Monarchs claimed monopolies over artillery manufacturing. In the Ottoman Empire, massive cannons were instrumental in the fall of Constantinople in 1453 under Mehmed II. After witnessing their destructive potential, governments carefully restricted who could own and produce such weapons. Gunpowder wasn't banned because it failed. It was restricted because it redefined power. Before mechanical clocks, time was measured by the sun, water clocks, or church bells. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, European engineers developed complex weight-driven mechanical clocks. These devices could regulate hours with increasing precision. Time became standardized. And that had consequences. Monasteries adopted clocks to regulate prayer schedules. Cities installed clock towers to coordinate markets and labor. But in some regions, especially where guilds controlled work hours, clock regulation created tension. Timekeeping became a tool of economic control. Workers resisted standardized hours. Authorities enforced them. In essence, mechanical clocks shifted time from a natural rhythm to a regulated commodity. This was not a ban in the traditional sense, but it was a transformation imposed through power structures. The control of time became the control of society. The Middle Ages were not technologically stagnant. They were politically volatile. When innovation shifted power, whether through information, weapons, or timekeeping, it triggered resistance. In Part 2, we examine technologies that were restricted not for military or political reasons, but because they challenged belief systems, medical traditions, and established worldviews. In the early Middle Ages, direct study of the human body was rare. Medical knowledge relied heavily on ancient authorities like Galen, whose anatomical descriptions were based largely on animal dissections. For centuries, scholars repeated his conclusions without verification. Human dissection became controversial in Christian Europe, not because science was rejected outright, but because burial practices and religious sensitivities made cutting the human body socially and spiritually sensitive. At various points, church authorities issued restrictions related to the handling of corpses. A papal decree under Pope Boniface VIII has often been interpreted as discouraging certain corpse practices, though historians debate its exact scope. By the 14th century, universities such as those in Italy cautiously reintroduced anatomical dissections. One key figure was Mondino de Luzzi, who conducted public dissections in Bologna. The resistance was never universal. But the hesitation slowed anatomical progress. The technology here was not a machine, it was a method. And the idea that knowledge could come from cutting open the human body was, for its time, deeply disruptive. In late 13th century Italy, artisans developed convex lenses mounted in frames, the first wearable eyeglasses. For aging scholars and monks, this was revolutionary. Reading could continue well into later life. Literacy could extend beyond youth. But optical devices also provoked suspicion in some communities. Magnification devices were sometimes associated with illusion, deception, or even occult practice. In societies where natural philosophy blended with theology, manipulating light itself could appear unnatural. Although eyeglasses were not formally banned across Europe, in certain regions their use spread slowly due to distrust of optical manipulation. The irony is striking. A tool designed simply to restore vision was occasionally viewed as interfering with divine design. Yet over time, lenses became essential not only for reading but for microscopes, telescopes, and eventually modern science. What began as a fragile medieval craft would later enable the discoveries of figures like Galileo Galilei. Today, we call them Arabic numerals. But their origins trace back to India before spreading through the Islamic world into Europe. By the 12th century, mathematical knowledge from scholars such as Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi began influencing European thinkers. One major advocate for the new numeral system was Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci. His 1202 book Liber Abaci introduced Europe to positional notation and the number 0. The system was vastly superior to Roman numerals for trade, accounting, and engineering. Yet resistance emerged. In 1299, the city of Florence reportedly restricted the use of Arabic numerals in official accounting. Authorities feared fraud. The unfamiliar symbols were seen as easier to manipulate. There was also cultural suspicion. The numerals came from the Islamic world at a time of religious and political tension. The ban was not permanent. Efficiency eventually won. But for a time, Europe hesitated to adopt a mathematical system that would later become the foundation of modern science, engineering, and finance. In medicine, vision, and mathematics, innovation faced resistance not because it failed, but because it challenged tradition. In Part 3, we move into technologies that directly threatened economic systems, social hierarchies, and centralized authority. When machines began replacing labor. And when encryption began hiding secrets. Control once again became the central issue. In medieval Europe, warfare was structured around hierarchy. Knights trained from childhood. Armor was expensive. Combat skill reinforced aristocratic dominance. Then came the crossbow. Unlike the traditional longbow, the crossbow required far less training. It could penetrate armor. A peasant with weeks of instruction could kill a mounted knight. That changed the equation of power. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council, convened under Pope Innocent II, formally condemned the use of the crossbow against Christians. The decree described it as a weapon hateful to God. The issue was not technical performance. It was destabilization. The crossbow threatened the military monopoly of the nobility. Although the ban was inconsistently enforced and ignored during Crusades, it represents one of the clearest cases of a medieval technology being officially restricted because it disrupted hierarchy. The weapon was effective. Perhaps too effective. Watermills were not new in the Middle Ages, but between the 9th and 14th centuries, their use expanded dramatically across Europe and the Islamic world. These machines automated grain grinding, a task that previously required human or animal labor. In feudal systems, mills were often controlled by lords. Peasants were legally required to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. But in some regions, independent or unauthorized mills were prohibited. Why? Because mills were economic infrastructure. If individuals built private mills, they bypassed feudal control. Revenue shifted. Authority weakened. The technology itself, gears, paddles, water flow engineering, was brilliant. Medieval millwrights developed surprisingly sophisticated mechanical systems. Yet the right to use that technology was tightly regulated. Innovation was allowed, but only under supervision. In the medieval Islamic world, scholars began analyzing coded messages with mathematical precision. One of the earliest systematic works on cryptanalysis came from Al-Kindi, who developed frequency analysis, a method still foundational in code breaking. In Europe, cipher systems gradually spread among diplomats and monarchies. Encryption created a new form of power, private communication. But secrecy can be threatening. In various medieval states, unauthorized encrypted correspondence was treated with suspicion. In later periods, governments required access to coded messages or punished those who concealed communication. While not universally banned, cryptography often existed in tension with authority. The issue was not mathematics. It was control over information. Encryption allowed individuals to hide knowledge from rulers. That shifted leverage. Even in the medieval world, privacy and surveillance were already in conflict. Weapons that empowered commoners. Machines that altered labor systems. Codes that concealed information. Each innovation shifted power away from centralized control. In Part 4, we explore technologies that were restricted not because they were violent or disruptive to labor, but because they challenged cosmology, navigation, and humanity's understanding of the world itself. When discovery expands horizons, authority often resists. The magnetic compass originated in China centuries before reaching Europe and the Islamic world. By the 12th and 13th centuries, mariners in the Mediterranean were using it for open sea navigation. This small device, a magnetized needle aligning with Earth's magnetic field, transformed maritime travel. Before the compass, sailors relied heavily on coastal navigation and celestial observation. With it, long-distance trade expanded dramatically. But navigation was not merely technical. It was economic and political. In several medieval maritime republics, navigational knowledge, including compass use and mapmaking, was treated as a state secret. Venice, for example, tightly controlled geographic intelligence to preserve its commercial dominance. While the compass itself was not universally outlawed, dissemination of navigational expertise was restricted. Exploration meant competition. Competition meant vulnerability. Technology that opened oceans also threatened monopolies. Medieval astronomy was far more advanced than commonly assumed. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars refined observational instruments such as the astrolabe and improved planetary models based on the work of Ptolemy. Figures like Ibn al-Haytham and later astronomers in Moraga developed mathematical critiques of geocentric assumptions. In Europe, astronomical study grew within cathedral schools and universities. But cosmology was closely tied to theology. When models began challenging traditional interpretations of the heavens, tension followed. Though the major heliocentric conflict would emerge later with Nicholas Copernicus, the medieval period laid the groundwork for questioning inherited cosmology. Certain interpretations were discouraged. Alternative frameworks circulated cautiously. The issue was not stargazing. It was the implication that Earth might not occupy the privileged center of the universe. In societies where cosmic order reflected divine order, such ideas carried weight beyond science. One of the most underestimated medieval innovations was the institutional hospital. In the Islamic world, large medical centers known as bimaristans operated with organized wards, pharmacies, and trained physicians. In Europe, hospitals expanded under monastic and civic administration. But during outbreaks of plague in the 14th century, authorities introduced something new: quarantine. In 1423, Venice established one of the first permanent quarantine stations on an island to isolate arriving ships. This was radical public health policy. Restricting movement for disease control often met resistance. Merchants opposed delays. Citizens feared isolation. Quarantine represented state intervention into private life for collective safety. While not banned, such measures were controversial and inconsistently applied. The balance between economic activity and public health became a political issue. The technology here was administrative, a system rather than a device. And it reflected growing institutional sophistication in managing society. By the late Middle Ages, innovation was no longer isolated to tools or weapons. It had become systemic, reshaping navigation, cosmology, medicine, and governance. In the final part, we examine technologies that were suppressed not out of fear of war or theology, but because they hinted at a future beyond medieval control. Technologies that would define the transition from medieval to modern. By the 13th and 14th centuries, European merchants had developed sophisticated financial instruments. One of the most transformative was the Bill of Exchange, a written promise to pay money in another city. It allowed merchants to travel without carrying large quantities of gold or silver. This was revolutionary. It reduced theft risk. It accelerated trade. It connected distant markets. But it also raised moral and religious questions. Charging interest on loans, known as usury, was widely condemned in medieval Christian doctrine. Theologians such as Thomas Aquinas debated the ethical boundaries of profit and lending. As a result, certain financial practices were restricted or legally limited in various regions. Yet the system proved too efficient to abandon. Italian banking families, including the powerful Medici Bank, refined credit networks that would eventually underpin Renaissance commerce. The innovation was not outlawed permanently, but it operated under scrutiny. Finance had become abstract. An abstraction unsettled tradition. By the late 14th century, portable gunpowder weapons began appearing across Europe and Asia. These early hand cannons and arquebus were crude, slow to reload, often inaccurate. But they had one decisive advantage: armor was no longer invincible. The medieval knight represented social order, landholding, chivalry, hereditary power. Gunpowder eroded that order. As with large artillery, monarchs increasingly centralized weapon production. Civilian ownership was restricted in many territories. Military authority tightened control over firearms. The issue was strategic. When technology levels the battlefield, hierarchy shifts. Within 2 centuries, armored cavalry dominance declined. Infantry equipped with firearms became central to warfare. Gunpowder did not merely change combat. It reshaped political structure. Long before the Industrial Revolution, medieval engineers were designing programmable machines. In the Islamic world, the polymath Al-Jazari described intricate water-powered devices, automated clocks, and even mechanical servants in his 1206 manuscript. These machines used cams, gears, and hydraulic systems. In Europe, cathedral clocks and automata amazed audiences with moving figures that struck bells or reenacted biblical scenes. Automation suggested something radical. Machines could replicate tasks previously performed by humans. Although such devices were often admired, they also inspired unease. Mechanical imitation of life blurred boundaries between craft and creation. In religious contexts, the idea of artificial motion sometimes carried symbolic weight. The technology itself was not systematically banned, but its implications were profound. Automation foreshadowed industrialization. And industrialization would eventually transform every structure medieval society relied upon. Final conclusion: rethinking the Dark Ages. The Middle Ages were not an era of intellectual stagnation. They were an era of negotiation between innovation and authority. Some technologies were restricted formally, like the crossbow. Others were regulated, controlled, or morally debated, like banking, printing, and dissection. Still others faced resistance because they disrupted hierarchy, economics, or cosmology. The pattern is clear. Technology becomes controversial when it shifts power. Whether through knowledge, weapons, mathematics, navigation, medicine, or automation, medieval inventors repeatedly demonstrated ingenuity. What limited progress was not lack of intelligence. It was fear of transformation. And that pattern, innovation followed by resistance, is not uniquely medieval. It is human.
Subscribe Info Beyond Borders now for more mind-blowing knowledge.